The porch visitor no one expected. The porch light flickered gently in the early morning haze, casting long shadows across the dewy grass. It was the kind of quiet dawn that settled over the forested outskirts of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the mountains stood watch and the world seemed to pause just long enough for the sun to stretch. But for Martha Blake, a retired elementary school teacher in her early 70s, this morning would mark the beginning of something that would shake her quiet life in a way no one, not even the wildlife rangers, could have foreseen. She spotted it through the fog, at first mistaking the dark lump on her porch for a soggy rug someone had carelessly left out. But as she pushed open the screen door, clutching a warm mug of coffee with one hand and her flannel robe closed with the other, the rug moved. Slowly. Deliberately. With the weary grace of something small and tired. A bear cub. Her breath caught in her throat. Not a stuffed toy, not a puppy, an actual, living, breathing baby bear. Curled against the porch railing as though it had been there all night, its fur damp with morning mist, the cub looked no older than a few months. Its coat was a rich chocolate brown, with a distinct V-shaped patch of creamy beige on its chest. Its small round ears were too big for its head, twitching at every creak of the floorboards. Mud crusted its paws. But it wasn't just the cub's appearance that rooted Martha in place, it was the look in its eyes. There was no panic, no threat. Just stillness. Those wide, dark eyes met hers with something far more haunting: trust. Or maybe hope. Or maybe, just maybe, something closer to a question. Martha stood in her slippers, barely blinking. "Oh, baby," she whispered. "Where's your mama?" The cub didn't move. By instinct more than reason, she set her mug down on the porch rail and slowly backed away into the house, her thoughts a whirl of confusion and caution. She'd lived in the area long enough to know that bear cubs never wandered alone unless something had gone very, very wrong. And if the mother was still alive, this situation could turn dangerous fast. She reached for the landline, yes, she still had one, and dialed the number for the local fish and wildlife office. Her voice trembled slightly as she explained the situation to the dispatcher, a young man named Greg who promised to send someone within the hour. "He's just sitting there," she murmured into the phone. "Not scared. Not aggressive. Just like he's waiting for something." Greg's tone turned thoughtful. "That's not typical behavior. Stay inside, Mrs. Blake. Keep an eye on him, but don't go back out. Our ranger will be there soon." The call ended, but Martha didn't move far. Through the lace curtain in her front window, she watched the cub. He hadn't budged. His head rested on his front paws, and occasionally, his tiny nostrils flared as he sniffed the air. He didn't look lost. He didn't look frantic. He looked like he belonged there. And that unnerved her more than anything. She wondered, absurdly, if he had done this before, curled up on a porch like a porch dog, waiting. But waiting for what? An hour passed. Then 2. The cub never left. By the time the wildlife ranger's truck pulled into her gravel driveway, the morning sun had burned away the last of the fog, revealing the full picture: a lonely bear cub curled up on a stranger's porch as if it were home. Ranger Eli Calder stepped out of the vehicle and approached the porch cautiously. In his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered with a calm demeanor that came from years of facing unpredictable animals, Eli knew better than to make assumptions. He exchanged a glance with Martha through the window, gave her a reassuring nod, and slowly knelt down a few feet from the cub. "That's a black bear cub, all right," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Male. Maybe 6 months. No tags. No collar." The cub lifted his head slightly and looked at him. Eli paused. "That's the calmest cub I've ever seen." Then, to Martha's shock, the cub stood. Not fast, not with fear or defensiveness. He rose slowly, with an awkward wobble that revealed a slight limp in his back leg, and padded to the edge of the porch. He stopped, turned around, and looked back at Eli and Martha in the window. Then sat down again. "He's not trying to run," Eli said. "He's trying to stay." Martha opened the door a crack. "But why here?" That's when Eli noticed something strange, an odd scuff mark on the cub's side. Dried blood near his left paw. And something else, too. He reached slowly into his bag for a pair of binoculars, not for the cub, but to scan the surrounding woods. Something was off. Terribly off. The bear had come from somewhere. Or perhaps, from someone. And it wasn't just the cub's presence that gave him that suspicion. It was the look in the little bear's eyes, an uncanny mirror of loss. Something had happened out there in the woods. Something that hadn't ended yet. And the cub might be the only witness left. The first encounter, a quiet mystery. The porch creaked gently under the weight of the small creature curled in the corner. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a bundle of fur forgotten by the wind. But as the morning sun lifted over the pines of rural North Carolina, it revealed something far more extraordinary, a bear cub, no bigger than a large dog, with round, wide-set eyes and a soot-black nose twitching in the cold. The cub's fur was dark brown with golden flecks that shimmered slightly in the dawn light, especially around its ears and downy chest. He couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Small. Vulnerable. Alone. And he wouldn't leave the porch. Laura McKinney, 63, stood behind the screen door in her flannel robe, holding a chipped coffee mug between hands that had raised 3 children, nursed a husband through cancer, and now lived in quiet solitude. Her home sat on 20 wooded acres passed down from her grandparents, pine-rich land just outside of Asheville. She hadn't seen a bear up close in years, and certainly not like this. The cub had appeared 2 mornings ago. Laura had spotted him nestled beside the planter box, shivering. Thinking it was a one-time fluke, she left a bowl of water and stepped back. But the next morning, he was there again. Then again. And again. By day 3, Laura had called animal control. But they were slow to respond, warning her not to feed it, not to touch it, and certainly not to let it linger. "It'll move on," they said. "Its mother is probably nearby. Give it space." But something in Laura said otherwise. The cub didn't seem lost, just patient. It didn't cry, didn't roam, didn't dig or climb or try to enter the house. It simply sat, watching the door, as if waiting for permission. There was a sadness in its eyes. A knowing. Laura decided she couldn't ignore him. Small acts of trust. On the 4th morning, Laura opened the screen door slowly and placed a shallow plate of cut-up apple slices on the top porch step. The cub didn't budge. He watched. She backed away. 10 minutes passed before he finally approached, moving not like a wild animal, but like something taught to be cautious. He sniffed the apples, nibbled 2 pieces, and returned to his corner. It became their routine. Every morning, Laura would place something soft, a banana, a handful of blueberries, once even leftover chicken. And every morning, the cub would accept it with cautious gratitude. Never aggressive. Never loud. Laura began talking to him through the screen door, telling him about her day, about the kids who never called, about the silence that filled the house since Frank passed 5 years ago. It was absurd, she knew. But it felt natural. She started calling him Oliver. By the end of the first week, Laura no longer needed the screen between them. She would sit on the porch, 4 feet away, knitting or sipping tea, while Oliver dozed near her rocker. He seemed to find comfort in her presence. And despite her better judgment, despite every warning from wildlife agencies and the voice in her head that whispered this was a bad idea, Laura felt comfort in his. The loneliness that had wrapped around her since Frank's death began to thaw, just a little. Tensions rise, the neighbors, the rules. The illusion of peace shattered on day 10. It started with a knock on the door. Sheriff Daniels, mid-50s, gruff but not unkind, stood on her porch with a clipboard and a frown. "Laura, I got 2 reports of a bear cub camped out here. You can't be feeding it. You know that." Laura crossed her arms. "I'm not keeping him. He just won't leave. Bears imprint. Even the young ones. If he starts associating your porch with food and safety, we've got a real problem on our hands. Especially come spring. You don't want him here when he's 200 pounds. Laura didn't argue. She knew he was right. But her heart twisted at the thought of shooing Oliver into the woods alone, in the dead of winter. "I'll stop feeding him," she promised. And she did. That night, no blueberries. No chicken. No soft words from the porch swing. Oliver sat in his usual corner, eyes following her, waiting. Laura closed the door and cried. A deeper mystery, the cub's unusual behavior. The next morning, Laura stepped outside just to check, and froze. Oliver was gone. Relief washed over her, followed by guilt, followed by confusion. Because something wasn't right. There, at the edge of the porch, lay a single item, a child's shoe. It was old, water-worn, and small, maybe toddler-sized. Laura picked it up, heart pounding. There were no children for miles. And Oliver had never carried things before. Something gnawed at her, something beyond the emotion of parting. A tension she couldn't name. Later that afternoon, he returned. And this time, he carried something else. Not food. Not mischief. A baby blanket. Tattered. Muddy. Human. Laura's stomach dropped. This wasn't random. The bear was trying to say something. Something was very, very wrong in those woods. A warning in fur and thread. By the time the second item appeared, another child's possession, this time a stuffed giraffe missing an eye, Laura's heart had begun to hammer at the sight of Oliver. The cub wasn't just returning out of attachment. He was bringing things. Small, personal things. Too personal. She picked up the toy with shaking fingers, brushing off leaves and dirt. The fabric was stained, the seams fraying from weather and time, but unmistakably, this had once belonged to a child. A beloved toy. And Oliver, small, silent Oliver, sat back, watching her reaction with a stillness that sent chills up her spine. This wasn't animal behavior. This was communication. Laura turned the giraffe over. On the faded tag, written in thick, black marker, was a name, Ellie. A missing piece from the news. Later that night, Laura sat at her kitchen table, laptop open and fingers trembling as she typed, "Missing child plus Ellie plus North Carolina." The first few results were old. Headlines from Charlotte, "Missing teens in Raleigh." Nothing matched. But on the third page, buried beneath unrelated articles, she found it. Toddler missing in Pisgah Forest, Amber Alert issued for Ellie Harper, age 3. Laura leaned closer, breath caught in her throat. The date was 10 days ago. Just before Oliver had arrived. She clicked the article. The toddler was last seen playing outside the family's rental cabin near the western edge of Pisgah National Forest. Her parents said she wandered out of sight for only minutes. Search and rescue teams had found no trace of her. Authorities believed a wild animal may have been involved. The search had been suspended due to heavy snowfall. Laura's blood ran cold. Pisgah was only 12 miles away. She looked out the window. Oliver was there, nestled in his usual spot, head resting on his paws, eyes trained on the door like always. But now she understood what those eyes were asking. Why aren't you listening? The search begins. The next morning, Laura didn't hesitate. She packed a bag, first aid kit, flashlight, bottled water, and stepped onto the porch wearing her thickest boots and a parka that had belonged to Frank. Oliver stood as she opened the door. For a moment, the cub looked uncertain, like he wasn't sure she'd follow. "I'm coming," she whispered. And that was all it took. Oliver turned and began walking, not scampering like a playful cub, but steadily, deliberately, into the woods. They traveled in silence, the forest swallowing sound except for the soft crunch of snow beneath boots and paws. The further they went, the colder the air felt. Pines rose tall and dark, casting long shadows even in morning light. Laura had no idea where they were headed. But she trusted him. Because this wasn't a random walk. Oliver had a destination. The hollow. After nearly 40 minutes of weaving through trees and climbing low hills, they came to a small ravine, a place Laura didn't recognize, despite having lived here for decades. The trees opened slightly, and at the bottom of the slope was an old hunting cabin, half collapsed, its roof bowed in and moss growing over the wooden slats. Oliver paused at the edge of the slope, then looked back. Laura's heart slammed. Was this it? She moved slowly down the incline, feet slipping a little on damp leaves. When she reached the cabin's front porch, just 3 sagging steps and a rotted-out door, Oliver remained at the edge, watching but not following. "Stay there, sweetheart," Laura murmured, her voice shaking. "I'll check." Inside, the air was cold and thick with the smell of mildew and thyme. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness in sharp, narrow strokes. Most of the furniture was overturned. Rodent droppings dotted the floor. It didn't look like anyone had lived here in years. Then she saw it. In the corner, tucked beneath a torn sleeping bag, was a tiny pink mitten. Laura rushed forward and swept the bag aside. Nothing. No child. Just dirt. Blankets. An old camping lantern. More stuffed toys. A worn children's book with teeth marks in the spine. But someone, some little someone, had been here. Recently. Very recently. Rescue or reminder. She turned to leave, and nearly screamed when Oliver stood in the doorway. Somehow, without making a sound, he'd crept to the porch and now blocked the exit with his small, dark form. He looked at her, then turned his head sharply, to the left. Laura followed his gaze. There, barely visible behind a wall of ferns and underbrush, was a second path, narrow, almost hidden. Had she missed it coming in? Oliver stepped aside and padded toward the ferns, stopping just before the opening and looking back. He was guiding her again. Laura pushed forward, the cold forgotten, her breath shallow with fear and hope and dread. The discovery. The path led to a rock overhang just large enough to provide shelter. A shallow cave. Nestled inside was a crumpled blanket, and a small, dirt-smudged girl with wide eyes and tangled blonde hair. She blinked at the flashlight. Too stunned to move. Too weak to scream. "Oh my God," Laura gasped. "Ellie?" The child didn't respond. But her lip trembled. Her hands twitched. She was alive. Laura fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped Ellie in her coat and held her close, whispering, "You're safe now. You're okay. You're safe." Behind her, Oliver sat silently at the cave entrance. The cub had done what no search party could. He had led someone to her. He had remembered. Understood. Tried to speak in the only way he could, by returning, night after night, with pieces of her story. And when no one listened, he waited. Until Laura did. The decision. Ellie was rushed to the local hospital that same afternoon. A deputy met Laura at the edge of the woods with flashing lights and a voice that trembled when Laura cried, "She's alive. She's okay. She's right here." The medical team was stunned. Ellie was malnourished and dehydrated, but alive, and even more remarkably, she hadn't suffered a single major injury. No broken bones. No frostbite. No trauma beyond exhaustion. She must have been protected somehow, the nurse whispered to Laura as they unwrapped Ellie's blanket. Out there in that cold, on her own for 10 days? Laura didn't say anything. But she looked out the window. Toward the forest. Toward where Oliver still waited. She hadn't seen him since the rescue. After Ellie had been found, the little bear had simply vanished into the trees. No fanfare. No farewell. Just gone. The story spread like fire through Ash Hollow and beyond. Missing toddler found alive in forest, read the headlines. But soon, the story shifted. Because Laura told the truth. Every word of it. From the first night she'd seen the bear cub on her porch, to the toys he brought, to the strange behavior that led her to follow him. And how, ultimately, he had guided her through the forest to Ellie. Many didn't believe her at first. A wild black bear cub leading a rescue? It sounded like a fairy tale. But the physical evidence, the toys, the path, the unmistakable stuffed giraffe, made it impossible to ignore. And Ellie herself, still too weak to speak in full sentences, reached for a crayon and drew 3 figures for her mother. A lady. A little girl. And a bear. The sheriff called in wildlife authorities. "I don't know what we're dealing with here," he told Laura one morning over coffee at the diner, his weathered hands wrapped tightly around a chipped mug. "But the kid wouldn't be alive if not for that bear. So we're not shooting him. I won't allow it. But he's still a wild animal. If he's hanging around humans, it's a problem." Laura nodded slowly. "He's not just hanging around," she said. "He's choosing to be near people. And not for food. For connection." The sheriff looked doubtful. So she showed him the footage. Because Laura had set up a trail camera on her porch, just in case. And that night, Oliver came back. The little cub stepped into frame, sniffed the porch swing where Laura often sat, and curled up again. Like he always had. Looking not hungry. Just lonely. The state wildlife department eventually agreed not to remove Oliver by force. But the consensus was clear, he couldn't stay. "He's too comfortable around humans," the lead biologist explained to Laura. "That makes him vulnerable. Not just to us, but to poachers, traffic, bad people. He needs care. Somewhere safe." So they offered an option: transfer to a wildlife sanctuary in Colorado. A place that specialized in raising orphaned black bears for eventual release, if possible. If not, they would provide lifetime care. Laura wrestled with the choice. She'd grown attached. Deeply. But she wasn't the one he'd saved. Ellie was. And he deserved a life that didn't end in tragedy because the world didn't know what to do with a miracle. On the morning Oliver was to be transported, Laura sat on the porch again. The transport truck waited quietly down the hill. A wildlife officer with a tranquilizer stood by, not as a threat, but as a precaution. But they didn't need it. Because Oliver came, like he always did. He stepped out of the trees with sleepy eyes and that same soft, loping walk. He looked a little bigger already, stronger from weeks of foraging and movement. But he still paused at the edge of the porch, as if seeking permission. Laura knelt and held out her hand, not expecting anything, just offering. To her astonishment, Oliver stepped forward and gently nuzzled her wrist. Just once. Then he backed away and sat, as if waiting. "I'm going to miss you," she whispered. "But you did what you came here to do." She looked toward the trees. "Now it's my turn to do what's right." Oliver was transported peacefully that afternoon. No cage. No panic. Just quiet understanding. And when the truck disappeared down the gravel road, Laura stood alone on her porch, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. A week later, Ellie was released from the hospital. She didn't speak much. Trauma still clouded her memories. But when her mother asked gently, "How did you stay warm out there, baby?" Ellie whispered, "My bear kept me warm." Not a bear. My bear. The phrase haunted Laura, in the best way. So she did something she never thought she'd do. She wrote the whole story down. Sent it to a wildlife magazine. And to a local journalist. And eventually, after the article went viral, she was contacted by a national documentary producer. "You sure this isn't fiction?" they asked. Laura smiled. "I wish it were," she said. "But you don't make up something like this." Spring came, and with it, letters from Colorado. The sanctuary sent photos: Oliver thriving, playing with other cubs. Learning to forage. Gaining weight. Growing into his name. They said he might be releasable. But even if he wasn't, he'd have a life of peace. Laura printed one of the photos and placed it in a frame on her mantel. In the picture, Oliver is half submerged in a pond, eyes closed in bliss as he floats like a little black boat, completely at ease. Below it, she placed a handwritten card that read, "To the bear who waited, and the woman who listened." Life in Ash Hollow didn't return to normal. It became something better. For weeks after Ellie came home, neighbors stopped by with casseroles and questions. Reporters left voice messages. The mail was stuffed with handwritten letters from strangers across the country, people who had read Laura's story and, for some reason, felt compelled to say thank you. Some thanked her for listening to a wild animal when no one else would have. Others said her story reminded them of something they'd forgotten, how the world still held wonder. Laura read every letter. She posted some on the fridge. Others she tucked into a shoebox under her bed labeled, "For Ellie, someday." And slowly, day by day, her daughter healed. The nightmares faded. The silence softened. Ellie started singing again, first under her breath, then louder, nursery rhymes with missing verses, sung in a voice that still shook but never broke. And every night before bed, she insisted on one thing. "Read me the bear story again." The town of Ash Hollow, once just another pinprick on the map of the Smoky Mountains, became known for something else, the place where a wild bear cub saved a child. Local businesses picked up on the story. A bakery made Oliver's honey buns. A school named their new reading corner, the Bear Denver. The town library, after receiving a grant from a wildlife foundation, set up a children's corner with a mural of Oliver, paws wrapped around a globe. But the most meaningful change came in the woods. Because after Oliver, people began seeing the forest differently. Not just as a stretch of untamed land, but as something alive. Communicating. Worth listening to. Hikers picked up trash with new reverence. Hunters asked more questions. And for the first time in town history, Ash Hollow passed a wildlife protection ordinance, declaring several acres around the edge of the forest as a peace zone for rehabilitated animals. They called it Oliver's Grove. 1 year after the rescue, Laura received a call from the sanctuary in Colorado. "Would you like to visit?" the woman on the line asked. It had taken them months, but they'd completed Oliver's behavioral assessments. And while the cub, now over 100 pounds and strong as ever, was social with other bears and independent enough to forage, they determined he was unlikely to succeed alone in the wild. "He's not tame," the voice said. "But he's different. He seems to be waiting for something. Or someone." They arranged a quiet visit. No press. No fanfare. Just Laura and Ellie, flying west with a carry-on full of granola bars and a stuffed giraffe. When they arrived at the sanctuary, Ellie was quiet. Nervous. She clutched Laura's hand tightly as they were led along a winding trail toward a shaded enclosure surrounded by trees and wildflowers. "He's right beyond that fence," the guide whispered. "Take your time." Laura stepped forward slowly, not sure what she expected. And then, a low huff. Not aggressive. Familiar. Oliver appeared from behind a cluster of rocks, lumbering with a deliberate gait, heavier now, older, but unmistakably him. His snout twitched as he sniffed the air. Then he turned his great, dark eyes toward Ellie. Ellie let go of Laura's hand. She stepped up to the fence, reached into her backpack, and held up the same stuffed giraffe, the one he had brought to her on that frozen porch all those months ago. Oliver didn't move. But he didn't walk away either. He just sat and watched. Quiet. Present. Remembering. Back home, Laura hung a second photo beside the one of Oliver in the pond. This one showed Ellie at the sanctuary, holding the giraffe up to the mesh, while Oliver gazed at her with something that looked an awful lot like understanding. Visitors always asked the same thing. Did he really save her? Laura never said yes or no. She simply pointed to the photo and replied, "You tell me." But one evening, when Ellie was older, maybe 8 or 9, she asked the same question, straight on. "Mom, why did Oliver help me?" Laura paused. Then smiled. "I think," she said, "because someone once helped him." Years later, when Ellie stood before a classroom giving her very first public presentation for Earth Day, she brought 2 things with her: a framed copy of the stuffed giraffe drawing she had made when she was 3, and a photo of Oliver lying in the pond. "My mom always says some animals just know how to love," she told her classmates. "Even if they're not supposed to." The kids clapped politely. The teacher cried quietly. And somewhere in the back of the room, Laura sat, hand over her heart, grateful for everything that had gone wrong, just right. Back in Colorado, Oliver still lives. Now nearly full-grown, he remains calm, healthy, and oddly responsive to human voices, especially soft ones. Sanctuary staff say he keeps a small pile of found objects in one corner of his enclosure: a stick, a crumpled glove, a piece of fleece from an old blanket. And once, after a heavy storm, he dragged a single teddy bear, torn from a visitor's dropped bag, back to his nest and lay beside it for hours. They say bears don't mourn. They say they don't remember. But in Ash Hollow, Tennessee, a little girl sleeps with a stuffed giraffe every night, and a woman still leaves a light on the porch. Just in case. Because sometimes love doesn't need language. Sometimes, it just shows up. Sits quietly. And waits.